The morning sun over the parade grounds of the Royal Military Academy was unforgiving, reflecting off the polished brass buttons and glass-like surfaces of thousands of boots. The air was thick with the scent of starch, gunpowder, and an underlying tension that only those who have lived under the thumb of strict discipline can truly recognize. I stood behind the velvet rope, my civilian clothes, a simple navy blazer and chinos, feeling like a neon sign of outsider status amidst the sea of olive drab and charcoal gray. I scanned the ranks of the graduating class, my heart hammering a rhythm against my ribs that no drill sergeant could ever syncopate. Then I saw her, my sister, Elena. She stood at the far edge of the 3rd platoon, her posture so rigid she looked more like a monument than a human being. The silver captain's bars on her shoulders caught the light, symbols of the 3 years of hell she'd endured to reach this point. I hadn't seen her in person since the day she left, a day marked by a brief, bone-crushing hug and a promise that we'd always be a team, no matter how many miles or regulations came between us. But as the ceremony began and the band struck up a somber, rhythmic march, the sister I knew seemed to have vanished. I leaned forward, trying to catch her eye. I wasn't looking for a shout or a wave. I knew the rules, but I was desperate for that tiny, nearly invisible twitch of the lip or a momentary softening of the gaze that we used to share across dinner tables when our father was being particularly difficult. Just a sign that she knew I was there, that she remembered the person who had sent her care packages of homemade cookies, hidden inside boot polishing kits. I waited for the moment when her platoon was ordered to at ease. As the tension in their shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch, I saw her head turn slightly. Her eyes swept across the crowd of families and dignitaries. My breath hitched. I raised my hand just an inch above the rope, a small, tentative gesture of recognition. Our eyes met. For a split second, the world narrowed down to just the two of us. Then, something happened that felt like a physical blow to my chest. Elena's gaze didn't linger. It didn't soften. Instead, her eyes turned cold, as if she were looking through a pane of glass at an empty street. Her jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in her cheek, and she deliberately looked away, focusing her stare on a point in the distant horizon. It wasn't just a look of professional focus. It was a calculated dismissal. She looked at me with the same clinical indifference she might show a smudge on a rifle barrel. The realization washed over me like ice water. I had spent my meager savings on a flight and a hotel, worked overtime for weeks to afford this trip, all to support the person I loved most. And there she was, standing in the glory she had fought for, acting as if I were a ghost. Or worse, a social embarrassment. I felt the heat rise in my neck. Maybe the rumors were true. People said the academy didn't just train you. It broke you and rebuilt you into something that didn't have room for weak civilian attachments. I watched her stand there, a perfect soldier, a perfect stranger. Every second that passed felt like another brick being added to a wall between us. The cheering of the families around me felt hollow, a mocking soundtrack to the quiet disintegration of the only family I had left. She was an officer now. She had a new family, a new creed, and apparently, a new history that didn't include a brother who worked a 9-to-5 job and still remembered her crying over a scraped knee. I lowered my hand, the weight of the navy blazer suddenly feeling like lead. I stood there, a silent observer in a world that clearly had no place for me, watching my sister pretend that I didn't exist. The ceremony droned on, a rhythmic blur of barked orders and the synchronized stomping of boots that echoed against the limestone walls of the courtyard. To the families around me, this was a display of peak human discipline, a ballet of power. But to me, every sharp movement felt like a shutter closing, locking Elena away in a world governed by iron and stone. I stood perfectly still, my hands shoved deep into my pockets to hide the slight tremor in my fingers, feeling the heavy, suffocating weight of my own expectations. I looked at her again, but she remained a statue. My mind drifted back to the last 2 years, the long stretches of silence that I had tried so hard to fill. I thought about the stack of letters sitting in a shoebox under my bed back home. I had written to her every Sunday night without fail. I wrote about the mundane things, how the neighborhood was changing, how the old oak tree in the backyard had finally lost a limb in a storm, how I'd finally gotten that promotion at the firm. I wrote those letters as if they were a lifeline, a way to keep her anchored to the world outside the barracks. For months, the replies were short, clipped, and censored by military brevity. Training is hard. Food is edible. Don't worry about me. Then, slowly, the ink dried up entirely. The letters stopped coming. I told myself she was busy. I told myself she was on blackout missions. I invented 1,000 heroic excuses for her silence because the alternative, that she simply didn't want to talk to me, was too painful to entertain. Watching her now, standing in the blistering sun without so much as a bead of sweat visible on her brow, I realized I had been mourning a version of her that no longer existed. This woman didn't care about the oak tree or the neighbors. She was a weapon forged in the fires of the academy. I felt a wave of profound displacement, a sense that I was an intruder at a funeral for our relationship. I had come here expecting a reunion, but I was witnessing a coronation of a stranger. The commander stepped up to the mahogany podium, his voice booming through the speakers, talking about the ultimate sacrifice and the shedding of the self. He spoke about how these men and women had left behind their old lives to become the shield of the nation. Every word felt like a personal indictment. I looked around at the other families, mothers weeping with pride, fathers standing tall, and I felt a bitter envy. They seemed to belong to this moment. They seemed to understand the price. I felt like a fool for bringing the small gift tucked into my inner pocket, an old, weathered photograph of us as children, taken the day we decided we'd always take care of each other. I had planned to give it to her at the reception, a reminder of where she came from. Now, the weight of that photograph felt like a burning coal against my chest. It was a relic of a dead civilization. The sun climbed higher, casting long, sharp shadows across the parade ground. The heat was becoming oppressive, radiating off the asphalt, but the soldiers didn't flinch. Elena didn't flinch. I watched her, searching for any sign of the girl who used to be afraid of the dark, the girl who used to stay up late with me planning our futures. There was nothing. Her eyes were fixed on the back of the person in front of her, cold and unyielding. I began to wonder if I should just leave. If I slipped away now, through the back of the crowd, she probably wouldn't even notice. I had fulfilled my duty as a brother. I had shown up. But as I turned my heels slightly, preparing to retreat into the anonymity of the city, the air changed. The commander stepped back, and a high-ranking general, decorated with enough ribbons to cover his entire torso, stepped forward. The standard procedure for the ceremony was supposed to move to the individual pinning of the ranks, but the general adjusted the microphone and looked directly into the crowd. His gaze seemed to scan the rows of civilians until it stopped, with unsettling precision, right on me. The atmosphere, already tense, tightened until it felt like a wire about to snap. I froze, my heart suddenly loud enough to drown out the wind, as the general cleared his throat and prepared to speak a name that had no business being heard on these hallowed military grounds. The general's voice didn't just carry through the speakers. It seemed to vibrate the very ground beneath my feet. Before we proceed with the formal commissioning of this class, he began, his eyes locked onto my section of the bleachers. There is a matter of unclassified record that demands our attention. We speak often of the front lines, of those who carry the rifles and fly the jets. But today, we must acknowledge the silent architecture of our safety. A confused murmur rippled through the crowd like a breeze through dry grass. I saw the soldiers in the ranks, those perfectly disciplined statues, shift almost imperceptibly. Elena's head didn't move, but I saw her jaw lock so tight I thought her teeth might crack. She was still staring straight ahead, but the mask of indifference was beginning to show microscopic fractures. She knew that tone. She knew that when a general speaks like that, the world is about to change. In the shadows of our most recent operations, the general continued, his hand resting on a small, velvet-lined box on the lectern, there was a vulnerability, a digital and logistical gap that could have cost us an entire battalion. This gap was closed not by a soldier in uniform, but by a civilian who possessed a unique set of skills and an even more unique sense of duty. This individual worked for 18 months in coordination with our intelligence directorate, often under extreme pressure and without the promise of public recognition. My ears began to ring. The secret I had kept for nearly 2 years. The reason for my own long nights. The consulting work I couldn't explain to friends. The coded messages I had to prioritize even over Elena's graduation details was being stripped bare. I hadn't told her because I couldn't. The non-disclosure agreements were backed by federal law, and more importantly, I didn't want her to worry about the target I had painted on my own back to keep her unit safe. This person's efforts directly intercepted the data breach that would have compromised the 4th Platoon's position during the November extraction, the general said, his voice dropping an octave in solemnity. I saw Elena's fingers twitch. The 4th Platoon. Her platoon. That was the mission where she had nearly lost everything. The one she had alluded to in her final, cryptic letter as the miracle on the ridge. She had thought it was luck. She had thought it was a mechanical failure on the enemy's side. The recipient of the Distinguished Civilian Service Medal is here today, the general announced, his voice now a clarion call. Would Mr. Julian Thorne please step forward to the dais? The silence that followed was absolute. It was a vacuum of sound that sucked the breath out of my lungs. Every head in the civilian section turned toward me. The soldiers, bound by protocol, remained facing forward, but I felt the weight of 1,000 curious stares. My legs felt like they belonged to someone else, heavy, wooden, and unreliable. I stepped over the velvet rope, the very barrier that had made me feel like an outsider only moments ago. As I began the long walk across the scorched asphalt toward the stage, the sound of my own shoes seemed deafeningly loud. I had to pass directly in front of Elena's row. As I approached her position, I didn't look away. I didn't play the game of pretend anymore. I looked right at her. For the first time that day, Elena broke. As I walked past her, her eyes didn't just follow me. They widened in a mixture of shock, realization, and a sudden, devastating clarity. The smudge on the rifle was gone. In its place was the brother she had thought was just a bystander in her glorious life. I saw the moisture glisten in her eyes before she caught herself, her training fighting a losing battle against her heart. She was seeing me, really seeing me, not as the civilian brother who didn't understand her world, but as the ghost who had been watching over her from the dark all along. I climbed the stairs to the stage, the general's hand extended, while behind me, the sister who had pretended not to see me was now unable to look at anything else. The stage felt like an island of heat and light in the middle of a vast, silent ocean. As I reached the top of the stairs, the general stepped out from behind the podium. Up close, he was even more imposing. A man whose face was etched with the lines of 100 difficult decisions. But as he looked at me, his expression softened into something resembling genuine gratitude. "Relax, son," he whispered, low enough that only I could hear. "You've earned this walk." He turned back to the microphone, his voice projecting over the thousands gathered. "Most of you see a young man in a civilian suit. What you don't see are the 342 soldiers of the 4th Platoon who are standing here today because of his intervention. During the height of the border conflict, our encrypted communication lines were compromised by a sophisticated insurgent cyberoffensive. We were flying blind. Our coordinates were leaked, and an ambush was set. I looked down at the front row of the graduating class. I could see the back of Elena's neck. It was flushed deep red. She was trembling just a fraction, but in the world of military precision, that tremor was as loud as a scream. Julian Thorne, the general continued, operating under a level 5 security clearance that prevented even his own family from knowing his whereabouts, spent 14 consecutive days inside a secure facility during the November crisis. He didn't just track the breach. He fed the enemy false data, leading them away from our extraction point and directly into a neutralized zone. He worked until his eyes bled from the strain, refusing to sleep until the 4th Platoon was confirmed safe on friendly soil. The crowd gasped. I remembered those 14 days. I remembered the cold coffee, the flickering monitors, and the overwhelming terror that if I missed a single line of code, my sister wouldn't come home in a uniform. She would come home in a flag-draped box. I had watched her unit's vital signs on a secondary screen, her heart rate a tiny, pulsing dot that kept me awake when my body wanted to collapse. The general reached into the velvet box and pulled out the Distinguished Civilian Service Medal. The gold glinted brilliantly against the sun. As he stepped forward to pin it to my blazer, he spoke into the microphone one last time. We often say that a soldier's first duty is to their country. But Julian Thorne reminded us that a citizen's greatest duty is to protect those who protect us. He did it without a uniform, without a weapon, and without the comfort of his family's understanding. As the metal pin pierced the fabric of my jacket, the weight of it felt monumental. It wasn't just gold and silk. It was the weight of every secret I'd kept, every lonely night I'd spent wondering if Elena hated me for my silence, and every unanswered letter I'd sent while I was simultaneously saving her life. The citation reads, "The General declared, for exceptional bravery and technical mastery in the face of imminent threat. By order of the Secretary of Defense, we honor a man who stood in the breach so that others might live." The general stepped back and offered me something I never expected. A crisp, formal salute. At that moment, the protocol of the ceremony shattered. It started with a single clap from a soldier in the back, then another, until the entire parade ground erupted into a thunderous standing ovation. The sound was like a physical wave, shaking the stage. I looked down at Elena. She wasn't looking at the horizon anymore. She had turned her head, breaking the eyes front command for the first time in her career. Tears were streaming down her face, carving tracks through the light dust on her cheeks. Her lips moved, and though I couldn't hear her over the roar of the crowd, I knew what she was saying. "I'm sorry." She wasn't just looking at her brother. She was looking at the man who had been her guardian angel in the dark, the one she had treated like an embarrassment, while he was busy ensuring she had a future to celebrate. The cold wall she had built between us hadn't just cracked. It had been demolished by the truth. The roar of the applause slowly subsided into a heavy, expectant silence as the general gestured for me to return to my place. But as I descended the wooden steps of the dais, the rigid clockwork of the military machine finally snapped. The dismissed order hadn't been given yet. The ceremony was technically still in progress. But for the first time in her decorated, disciplined life, Captain Elena Thorne didn't care about the regulations. She moved before I even reached the bottom step. In a blur of olive drab and polished leather, she broke formation, her boots echoing with a frantic, uneven rhythm against the asphalt. The officers on the stage stiffened, and a few of her fellow graduates gasped. But she didn't stop. She ran toward me, the ironclad composure she had cultivated for years dissolving with every stride. When she reached me, she didn't just hug me. She collided with me, her arms wrapping around my neck with a strength that nearly knocked the breath from my lungs. I felt the cold metal of her rank insignia press against my cheek and the dampness of her tears soaking into my blazer. She was shaking, not with the slight tremor I had seen before, but with deep, racking sobs that she made no effort to hide from the thousands of watching eyes. "Julian," she choked out, her voice raw and stripped of its military bark. "I didn't know. Oh God, I had no idea. I thought you'd moved on. I thought you didn't understand what I was doing out there." I held her tight, my own eyes blurring. The photo in my pocket, the one I thought was a relic of a dead past, felt warm against my chest. "I understood, Elle," I whispered into her ear. "I understood better than anyone. I just couldn't tell you. I had to make sure you came back to hear it." She pulled back just enough to look me in the eye. The mask of gold was gone. Her face was flushed, her beret was slightly askew, and she looked exactly like the sister I remembered, the one who used to share her secrets with me under the covers of our bunk beds. She looked at the metal pin to my chest, her fingers hovering over the gold surface as if she were afraid it would vanish if she touched it. "The November extraction," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We were pinned down on that ridge. We thought the comms were dead, but then the enemy they just moved away. They left the canyon open. We thought it was a miracle. We called it the ghost in the wire." She looked at me with a reverence that made my throat ache. "It was you. It was always you." I nodded slowly. "I watched your heart rate on my monitor for 72 hours straight, Elena. I wasn't going to let that light go out. Around us, the protocol of the day had completely disintegrated. The general stood on the stage, watching us with a small, knowing smile, ignoring the breach of conduct. Other soldiers were whispering, their eyes filled with a new kind of respect. They didn't see a civilian and an officer. They saw a debt of honor being paid in the only currency that truly mattered, blood and family. Elena took a deep breath, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. She stood up straight, regaining a fragment of her military bearing, but her eyes remained soft, anchored to mine. In a gesture that stunned the remaining crowd, she stepped back, clicked her heels together with a sharp, metallic snap, and brought her hand to her brow in a perfect, razor-sharp salute. It wasn't a salute to a superior officer. It wasn't a salute to a government official. It was a salute from a soldier to the man who had saved her soul without ever picking up a gun. It was her way of saying that the hierarchy of our lives had shifted forever. I wasn't just her civilian brother anymore. I was her equal in the silent war she had been fighting alone. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long golden shadows across the parade ground, we walked off the field together. She kept her arm locked in mine, her fingers gripping my sleeve, as if she were afraid I might disappear back into the shadows of the intelligence world. The letters didn't matter anymore. The silence was over. We walked past the velvet ropes and the limestone walls, leaving the rigid world of the academy behind us. For the first time in years, we weren't a soldier and a secret. We were just two siblings, finally going home, protected by a truth that no longer had to be hidden.